Before we actually speak about your new book, I wanted to talk about your previous work on empathy, which I think is also very relevant, and in a way is a segue to the LongueDurée and to your book, to the Good Ancestor. The other day I was rereading Sylvia Wynter, a lot also through Alexis Pauline Gams, who wrote this wonderful book, Dab. And Sylvia Wynter, of course, is someone who is studying the multiple histories of knowledge. And in a way, we, as Alexis says, we have the opportunity now as a species fully in touch with each other, also through technology, to unlearn and relearn our patterns of thinking and storytelling in a way that allows us to be actually in communion with our environment, as opposed to a dominating colonialist separation from the environment. That of course, is very much related to your work on empathy and your work of the Time Rebel. It's a book which has created, as you said, a museum. It has created a movement. Can you tell me a little bit about this work on empathy, what triggered it, how it evolved, where it stands now, and how it's in a way the possibility to go beyond, through empathy, beyond the separation also from the environment?
So I've been writing about empathy for about 15 years, and I wrote a book called Empathy, partly in recognition that I started seeing what seemed to be a growing empathy deficit in society, growing polarizations between left and right, or young and old, or migrants and non-migrants. And I also realized, though, that the capacity to step into the shoes of another person and look at the world through their eyes, which is what's technically called cognitive empathy or perspective-taking empathy, is something that develops in us all from early age. You know, so my children, when my twins were about 3 or 4, they started developing this capacity to see the perspective of the other. So when they were very little, if my son was crying, his sister would sometimes try to comfort him with her favorite toy dog, which was no use. But by the time they were 3 or 4, when he was crying, she would go and comfort him with his favorite toy cat. And this is actually, in a way, goes back to the work of Piaget and early child psychology, the idea that we are able to see the perspective of the other. And this is so fundamental for social struggles. I grew up in Australia, where the Indigenous population had been written out of history and Indigenous knowledge and culture. And it was only probably in my 20s that I started thinking about Australian history from the perspective of the Indigenous population. And that's about an empathic leap to another perspective. And so for many years, my work was focused on how do we expand our moral circle by stepping into the shoes of the other. And of course, there's an extension of that, because then, well, can we do that with the living world as well? Can we do that with animals, with trees, with landscapes? How do we take the perspective of a mountain or a molehill? And at the same time, I started realizing that what I was writing about empathy, it wasn't enough for it to just be in the pages of a book. So I founded an international arts organization called the Empathy Museum, and which travels around the world. It's got a fantastic director and curator called Claire Patey. And one of our exhibits, which is actually in Australia at the moment, is called A Mile in My Shoes. And it directly relates to your question in a way. And this particular piece is a gigantic shoebox that you can walk inside. It's the world's first empathy shoe shop. And you go in and someone will fit you with the shoes of a stranger. It could be a Syrian refugee, or someone who's been in prison for 14 years, or a Brazilian sex worker. And you can literally walk a mile in their actual shoes while listening to an audio narrative of them talking about their own life in their own words. And, you know, we've collected hundreds of shoes and stories in that project. But one of the things I realized a few years ago was that project, and a lot of my work on empathy, was about stepping into the shoes of people in today's world, the marginalized, the voiceless. But what about future generations? How do we bring them into the room when you can't look them in the eye or slip on their shoes or hear their voices? And that's really the impetus behind my new book, The Good Ancestor, to try and take empathy from space and start extending it for the longue durée over time.
And how was basically the influence or the inspiration from Fernand Braudel? Because of course the LongueDurée is came out of the French Annales School of historical writing, a school actually which gave priority or put the sort of emphasis on long-term thinking as opposed to sort of event thinking, or I think as François Simeon called it, as evental history. No, it's basically a priority of long-term history as opposed to evental history. And that's, of course, very relevant in relation also to what's happening with curating, what's happening with exhibitions, what's happening with museums. We're working, for example, on Back to Earth at the Serpentine. We're working at the same time also on radio ballads in Barking Dagenham. And these are all projects with artists, with communities, which are long duration projects. They go beyond the horizon of an exhibition. And it's something I've always been interested in already in the 90s. We started doing, how can be an exhibition, or actually how can we curate an exhibition on which we work for 20, 30, 50 years, so that it's actually the opposite of event culture. So I was curious how, in a way, your work was impacted by this French Annales School of historical writing and what you learned from Braudel.
Yes, I'm really interested in the Annales School because partly, actually, I used to be a political scientist, very much focused on analyzing the present tense. But I remember coming across this wonderful quote from Goethe, who said, "He who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living from hand to mouth." And that started getting me thinking about, what have we inherited from the past, from previous cultures? How did the Greeks think about love, and how has that shaped us today? What have we learned from the Renaissance ideals of death, and how are they shaping our thinking about mortality today? But the Annales School was really important because what it did is it grounded a long-term historical perspective in social history and economic history particularly. It wasn't just looking at kings and queens and governments, it was grounding it in bigger social, cultural, and economic transformations. And if you're interested in long-term thinking about the future, as I am, what legacy we're going to leave for future generations, we must engage with the past. We need to understand about the legacies that we've inherited. And the Annales School really created a body of historical work, helping us understand, in a way, grasp what those legacies were. Because in many ways, of course, we have inherited positive legacies from the past, the cities that we still live in, the medical discoveries that we've benefited from. And some of those are positive, but we've also inherited negative legacies of slavery and colonialism and racism, creating deep inequities that must now be repaired. Legacies of economies that have been structurally addicted to economic growth, endless growth, and fossil fuels that must now be transformed. And so I think if we don't understand that long history, particularly the social and economic history we've inherited, we can't really pinpoint, well, in what ways do we need to change the way we think about the future? It's a little bit like, most religions and ethical systems have some concept of the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But I like thinking of an intergenerational version. Let's do unto future generations how past generations have done unto us. And so we need to think about, well, what do we want to carry on from our ancestors and what do we want to leave behind? And I think some of the art projects that really inspire me are ones that tap into this sense of a legacy, that go beyond curating for the here and now. Things like Katie Patterson's 100-year art project, Future Library, I think is a wonderful example, where every year for 100 years, as you know, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely secret and unread in the Future Library until the year 2114, when the 100 books will be printed on the paper made from 1,000 trees which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. And Margaret Atwood was the first person to donate a book, Elif Shafak and many others. And just think, Margaret Atwood will never meet the readers. She will be long dead. Who are they going to be? And that is a kind of gift to the future. And that really is the question I think we're facing in the arts, in the sciences, politics, economics. What gifts are we going to leave to those who are going to inhabit the world. There are 7.7 billion people alive today. In the next 50,000 years, an estimated 7 trillion people will be born, assuming current birth rates stabilize. Even in the next 2 centuries, tens of billions of people will be born. So what kind of cultural legacy are we going to be leaving them?
Now, this is fascinating because, of course, we met thanks to Brian Eno, and we obviously hope also that we can involve you in the forthcoming, Serpentine Back to Earth project, which is this project we're working on with Brian and many artists. And you also mentioned in your book, actually, Brian's long durational project, the collaborative project of this long durational clock. That was also an inspiration for you, no?
Absolutely right. So the 10,000-year clock, as it's called, is a project of the Long Now Foundation based in California, where I'm a research fellow. And one of the first projects that they began developing in the late 1990s was the idea of building a clock that would stay accurate for 10 millennia. And that clock is being built as we speak inside a limestone mountain in the Texas desert. And it's quite complex, the engineering, because it needs to stay accurate with prospective temperature changes and so on. But the idea is that this clock is almost like a secular altarpiece to a long-term thinking civilization, a marker, a reminder of us to take responsibility for the world that future generations will inherit. And to visit the clock, you'll have to hike through the desert for a day or two to get there, and then walk up steps cut into the mountainside, which are the equivalent of 1 million years of geological time each. And when you go inside, you will hear each day a different chime, combination of 10 chimes designed by Brian Eno using an algorithm, so that every day for 10,000 years, every single day, there will be a different combination. And this is a classic Brian Eno piece of music, of course, which is about regenerative music. This is music which has a very long duration, but is not repetitive. It is ever changing. And there's a really interesting connection here, I think, between that kind of regenerative music making and music design and regenerative economic design. How do we create economies that have this kind of long duration as well, which have a dynamism, like the idea of the circular economy or the donut economy? All these ideas are a little bit like a shift away from the mechanistic thinking of the Enlightenment, away from Enlightenment progress, endless growth going up all the time, away from, I don't know, Johann Sebastian Bach and the sort of the mechanistic, pieces of music he was making, or the way fugues worked, to something that is actually has a different time span, coming from somewhere very different.
Thank you so much. Now, another inspiration, which is very, very important in the book, is actually, and you summarize it in your writing on the 7th generation principle, is the inspiration really from Indigenous knowledge, the inspiration for long duration thinking, which basically has to do with considering the interest of future generations in every present day decision. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about this dimension of inspiration, because it's very crucial in your book?
That's absolutely right. I mean, many indigenous cultures have forms of long-term thinking and intergenerational justice built into their cultural community decision-making practices. A classic example is the Native American idea found in Iroquois and Dakota communities of 7th generation decision-making. So making decisions based on the impact 7 generations from today, maybe 150, 200 years. In Aotearoa in New Zealand, in Maori culture, there is a concept called whakapapa, spelt with a WH. It looks like wakapapa, but whakapapa, which is their word for genealogy or lineage. And it's the idea that we are all connected in a great chain of life going long into the past and far into the future. And it so happens that the light is shining on the here and now. And what we need to do is broaden that light so that the living, the dead, and the unborn are all here in the room with us. Now, the challenge there is, how do we bring that kind of thinking, and which is particularly about ideas of deep ecological stewardship, how do we bring it into fast-moving urban societies? How do you make it relevant for the people of Miami, Dubai, or Shanghai? And there's some really amazing, inspiring movements which are picking up on this kind of thinking and taking them outside indigenous cultures and adapting them. So in Japan, there is a movement called future design, and it's all about local government decision making. And what they do is they invite local citizens of a town or city to discuss and draw up plans for the town and city where they live. And they typically divide them into two groups. Half of them are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these almost ceremonial robes to wear, like kimonos. It's like role play, and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out that when imagining themselves as residents from 2060, the people come up with far more radical and transformative plans for their cities, whether it's healthcare investment or action on climate change and COVID or artificial intelligence. And this future design movement is spreading across Japan to major cities like Kyoto. It's even used in Japan's Ministry of Finance. And it's interesting that it's emerging in Japan, a culture with very long traditions of ancestor worship. You know, Japan has more than 3,000 companies that are over 200 years old. It has some companies like breweries and robe makers that are more than 1,000 years old. So they're coming out of, on one sense, of a hyper-modern culture, but also a very deeply ancestral culture, are really innovative ways of thinking for the longer now.
So there is the inspiration from artists, the inspiration from indigenous cultures. There is, of course, also sci-fi, and you mentioned N.K. Jemisin, Ursula Le Guin. I would be curious to hear a little bit about that, because it's actually a recent interview of yours where you talk about time rebels and also about the long durational idea and the idea how to liberate ourselves from short-termism, and sci-fi can actually help us with that.
I think sci-fi is a really important way of opening our imaginations, inspiring us for what we're actually quite good at, which is the temporal pirouette, as I call it, our capacity to dance across time horizons. One moment you can be thinking of looking at your phone on a cycle of seconds, but we can also be thinking about the long future, planning for our pensions. But sci-fi takes us even further. You've got writers like N.K. Jemisin, as you mentioned, Ursula Le Guin. Going back to the 1930s was Olaf Stapleton, the British philosopher and sci-fi writer, who wrote a book called Last and First Men, which is on the scale of billions of years. The writer I'm particularly interested in at the moment is the US sci-fi author Kim Stanley Robinson. Now, many of his books take our minds forward 100 years, 200, 300 years. And what's really interesting about his work is that it's very much grounded in ecological economics, the idea that we shouldn't be creating more waste than the planet can naturally absorb, or creating or using resources more quickly than they can be naturally regenerated, like not cutting down trees faster than they can grow back. And all his work is around this. He's written a recent book called The Ministry for the Future. And unlike a lot of his books, which are set 2 or 3 centuries ahead, this one is set over the next 30 years. It's about what happens when we fail to meet the Paris Accord targets of staying below 1.5 degrees, or at least 2 degrees. And he tracks the development of the human response between basically 2025 and 2040. So not very long sci-fi, but it is incredibly inspiring because it's playing out the future for us. And this is what we need fiction for. And I think it can do it a lot better than Hollywood sci-fi films, which tend to be rather voyeuristic. Things like Geostorm or The Day After Tomorrow. You get exceptions like Blade Runner 2049, I think, is a very deeply realized work of art, which is obviously dystopian, but it has a ambiguity and complexity in it that fiction has, but that a lot of Hollywood sci-fi doesn't have.
No, I'm really happy you mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson. We worked with him a few years ago, and also actually had a collaboration with him and Marina Abramovic. And of course, there is also the Mars trilogy. That's another very important long durational, one can say, aspect of the book. Now, I think we talked about many different inspirations. I wanted to now come to the very pragmatic aspect of your book, which is actually the ways you show us to actually to learn how to think long-term, but not only to learn how to think long-term, but also to unlearn the short-termism. You sort of give us 6 ways to liberate us from short-termism, which I think makes the book such an amazing toolbox. And I think it's great for our participants at E.A.T to maybe hear from you these steps. How can everyone be liberated from short-termism? How can we all become good ancestors? Can you tell us these 6 steps: the cathedral thinking, the deep time humility, the legacy mindset, the intergenerational justice, the holistic forecasting, and last but not least, of course, also the transcendental goal?
Yeah, so the way I see it is that human beings have a capacity to think long-term. Our brains are wired for it, and our frontal lobes are designed to think and plan and strategize over the long term more than most other animals, but we don't do it very often. Of course, we can see examples around us like the cathedrals of medieval Europe. This is what the idea of cathedral thinking is about. One of my 6 ways to think long term. That's the idea of embarking on plans and projects with very long time horizons. So look at Ulmünster in southwest Germany, begun in the 14th century. Well, they didn't finish building it for more than 500 years until 1890. That's the kind of long-term thinking we need. Cathedral thinking. Greta Thunberg has famously said we need cathedral thinking to tackle the climate crisis. So that's one step to being a good ancestor, as I call it, to master cathedral thinking. But the problem is, of course, cathedral thinking isn't always good for us. You know, Hitler wanted an 1,000-year Reich. A former head of Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, said, we're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. Well, that's a very narrow form of cathedral thinking. So we need other ways to think long-term as well. And that brings me, for example, to the idea of intergenerational justice, which is one of the second ways to think long-term. And that really relates to that idea of, well, what obligations do we have to future generations? I mean, a lot of people might be inspired by Groucho Marx, who said, why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me? And I think often people feel that they're just dealing with the stuff in their own life today. But I believe we do have obligations to those future generations. And I think the indigenous idea of 7th generation decision making, as we've talked about, is part of intergenerational justice thinking. Or we can draw on thought experiments, for example, from the philosopher John Rawls, who asked us to imagine being behind what he called a veil of ignorance, where imagine you don't know what's part of society you're going to be born into. You don't know whether you're going to be rich or poor or black or white or Muslim or a Jew or whatever it is. But then he also said, don't just imagine what space you might be born into or what social background, but imagine you didn't even know what generation you'd be born into, whether you're going to be born 10 years from now or 100 years from now. And, you know, if you take that thought experiment seriously and try to imagine you could be born just not just anywhere in the world, but at any time through history, well, that's going to really shape the kind of world we're going to make, because we're not just going to trash the future. You know, I believe we've colonized the future. We treat it as a dumping ground for ecological damage and technological risk. And things like that Rawlsian experiment of intergenerational justice can help us think about what our impacts might be. Now, a third way to practice the art of being a good ancestor is what I call deep time humility. And this is the idea of recognizing that the human species has only been an eye blink in the cosmic story. We've only been around for a couple of 100,000 years. Of course, deep time is something that's been explored very much by artists since the early 19th century. You know, in the 1830s, when artists in Dorset, in Lyme Regis on the coast of England, started gathering fossils of dinosaurs that had been found and doing watercolors of what Lyme Bay might look like, trying to create a kind of 19th century Jurassic Park to send our minds back into the past. And now we've got many other examples of deep time artworks, you know, around. For example, Rachel Sussman, the American photographer, has this project called The Oldest Living Things in the World, where she was photographing living things like trees or mosses, which were at least 2,000 years old. It's a wonderful exhibit, very much about deep time. But I think deep time really raises a question for us, which is, well, what right have we got to break the great chain of life? You know, in just a couple of centuries, we have done untold damage, but trying to connect with deep time is quite difficult. You can go hunting for fossils and hold a 195 million-year-old belemnite in your hand to give you a sense of awe and wonder. But a lot of us don't really connect with that. Recently, on my 50th birthday, I went with my wife and kids to a 1,000-year-old yew tree, about a 5-minute bike ride from where we live in Oxford in the UK. And we went and climbed into the tree and we had a picnic inside the yew tree. And it was about connecting with those deeper cycles of time. So deep time, I think, is important. I think a fourth way to practice being a good ancestor, a fourth cognitive tool, is the idea of developing what I call a legacy mindset. And this is about really trying to make an emotional connection with future generations. I am not saying this is easy, but just to give you an example, my daughter is 12 years old. She could easily be alive in the year 2100. She'll be 92. And if I close my eyes and imagine her on her 92nd birthday, it can be quite a frightening thing, because I look out the window and I don't see a world of milk and honey. I see a world on fire. And I know that if she has children or grandchildren, they could be alive well into the 22nd century. So their future is not science fiction. It is an intimate family fact. And if I care about my daughter's life when she's an old woman, I need to care about all life, because she's not alone. She's part of a network, a web of living beings, and the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the future she eats, and the water she drinks. So I think that kind of thinking about what our legacies will be, by thinking about our family legacies, our own bloodlines, in a way, it can be a bridge to something a bit more transcendental, knowing that the world my daughter's going to live in, I want that world to be one that sustains her, but that can sustain everybody else as well. So that's really the heart of a legacy mindset. The idea of holistic forecasting is to really get away from the corporatized idea of thinking about the future, where you're forecasting your market share or revenues or profits over a 3 or 5, maybe 10-year period, and to literally try and forecast the trajectory of human civilization itself as a global phenomena. It's not something we do very often, but look at the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're starting to look at what the impacts of our carbon emissions or sea level rises over 100, 200, even 500-year period. And basically, what we need to recognize is this: no civilization lasts forever. A famous study was done of ancient civilizations by a Cambridge scholar called Luke Kemp. He found out that the average age of an ancient civilization like the Romans or the Assyrians was 336 years. And it's a reminder that our global capitalist civilization is likely to go the same way as the Roman Empire or the Mayans. In other words, into decline, because nothing grows forever, and we need to jump onto a transformative civilizational pathway. And that brings me to the final form of being a long-term thinker and good ancestor, which is the idea of grasping a transcendent goal. I think here we need to throw away the Enlightenment mythology of perpetual progress, the kind of thing that Steven Pinker writes about, the idea that we can just keep growing, growing, and growing. Technology is going to solve all our problems. Growth is going to solve all our problems. Even my kids know you can't keep blowing up a balloon bigger and bigger without it ever going to pop. It's something I don't think Steven Pinker and others of his persuasion have learned. We have to get off that perpetual growth mindset, because we know we're using at least 1.6 planet Earths each year. We cannot sustain this over the long term. We need to go onto another path where we, what I call one planet thriving, meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet, both future and current generations. But therein lies the trick to long-term thinking, because long-term thinking isn't just about expanding our sense of time, our time horizons. It's also about regenerating place. It is about falling in love with rivers and mountains and ice sheets and savannas. Because how is it that other species have learned to survive and thrive over the long term? Well, it's by not fouling the nest, by living within the boundaries of the ecosystem in which they are embedded. That's why we need regenerative economic ideas and the circular economy. because it's about embedding us in place, restoring and repairing and caring for this world that will take care of our offspring. And it reminds me of this beautiful Indigenous Mohawk blessing, which is spoken when a child is born. Thank you, Earth. You know the way.